Chapter 6. The next order of business was the little matter of where to put our tent. Naturally, we were going to have to be very careful. It went without saying that if the girls ever caught us living in a Hansel and Gretel's gingerbread house tent with candy canes and sugar plums all over the place, we'd have to hide out for the rest of our lives. What we needed, Pete and I agreed, was a totally secret place to set up the tent, a place nobody could ever find. And we needed it in a hurry, too. Big black thunderheads were building up in the sky to the north. A storm was coming, and we were going to need shelter quick. We loaded all our stuff in the canoe, and within minutes we were paddling along the west side of the island, hugging the shore, keeping our eyes peeled for a possible hideout. Whenever we saw a good landing place, we pulled in and did some quick exploring on foot. About a quarter of a mile north of our starting point, on our fourth stop, we hit pay dirt. We stumbled onto the world's best hiding place. It was perfect. So perfect, we never would have found it if we hadn't gotten lost. From our canoe, we'd spotted what looked like a cave on the side of a low hill. We beached our canoe and hiked inland to check it out. It turned out to be only a shallow opening under a rock outcropping, so we started back, and that's when we got lost. When we finally came out near the shore, it was at a place where an enormous rock, 20 or 30 feet high and about 60 feet wide, jutted into the lake. As we were pushing our way through the underbrush at the base of the rock, Pete happened to notice a long, narrow shelf bending around the left side of the rock. It was barely above water level. We investigated and found that there was just enough room, if we turned sideways, to squeeze by without slipping into the water. "Me Pathfinder," said Pete, leading the way. On the back side of the rock, cut off from the rest of the island, we found our new home. A small, flat promontory with a cozy little clearing right in the middle of it. All around the edges of the promontory was a thick growth of trees and underbrush, so that the clearing itself was almost entirely hidden from anyone who might canoe by on the lake. All we had to do was plug up a few holes here and there with dead branches, and we'd have complete privacy. We were both pretty excited, and right away Pete named it Hidden Valley. But it's not a valley," I pointed out. "Yeah, but it has a good ring to it," he said. "And anyway, it'll confuse the enemy in case they ever overhear us talking about it." I couldn't argue with that. Besides, now that we'd found a campsite, we had to move fast. The thunderstorm was closing in. The sky had turned a dark gray, and the temperatures were dropping. The wind gusted across the lake. First we found our canoe, paddled it to the promontory, and dragged it up into the trees so it couldn't be seen. Then we unpacked our tiny tot tent for backyard camping and hurriedly began setting it up in the clearing. Just across the lake, jagged bolts of lightning were flashing out of the gray clouds. I measured the time between one of the flashes and the loud clap of thunder that followed. 2 seconds, which meant the lightning was less than half a mile away. Close. By the time we finished pitching the tent and rolling out the plastic cobblestone sidewalk with the tulips alongside, the first raindrops had begun to fall. Big, bloopy drops that made a little splash when they hit you. We grabbed our gear, threw it inside, and just as the downpour really began, dived in ourselves. So, there we were, surrounded by the deluxe model of Hansel and Gretel's gingerbread house tent. For a minute, Pete and I just stood there, letting our eyes adjust to the dim light. The rain beat down on the canvas roof, making a loud drumming sound. Finally, Pete got out his flashlight and shined it on one of the walls. There was the witch, still there, still goofy-looking, smiling sweetly, offering us cupcakes. Trying to ignore the tent seemed like the best course of action. So we waited out the storm by unpacking a couple of books, lounging against our rolled-up sleeping bags, and reading by flashlight. Pete started a book called Escape to Terror River, and I began a new chapter in my astronomy book about the moons of Jupiter. The storm was violent but short. As soon as it passed, Pete and I got back to work and finished setting up camp. Even though the sun had set, there was still a little light to work by. Together we built a fire ring with stones we hauled up from the lake shore. Then we gathered as much firewood as we could carry from the other side of the big rock. While we were there, we made sure to camouflage the entrance to the shelf leading to Hidden Valley. No human, Pete informed me, could find us now. We cooked a great dinner. Well, actually, I guess it wasn't really all that great. All it was beans and Kool-Aid. But it seemed great because we felt so great. There we were, on our own, cooking out under the stars on a warm August night. The sky had cleared, and the Milky Way really stood out, streaming across the sky like a ghostly white river. Even Pete thought it was beautiful. After dinner, our thoughts turned to the girls and to our master plan. We weren't going into action until about midnight, so we had plenty of time to relax around the campfire, listening to the crickets, watching the fireflies, and ironing out the details of our plan of attack. Ah, sweet revenge. It was a dark and moonless night. Just the sort of night that brings out the worst in a vampire wolverine. Grrr, grrr. It was 11 o'clock, still an hour before the attack. Pete stood in the flickering light of our campfire. His face was red. His eyes were wild and gleaming. Heaving, gasping, he clawed the air with his hands. Grrr, grrr. Hold it! Hold it! Hold it! I interrupted, shaking my head. That's good, Pete. That's really good, but I think it sounds a little too much like a bear. It's got to be a wolverine. I tell you what, see if you can add a little wild boar to it. That might help. Right, said Pete. He shut his eyes and took a few deep breaths, preparing himself. Neither of us had ever heard a wolverine before, but I knew I could count on Pete to come up with something convincing. Pete's face took on a sort of snoutish appearance, so I knew he was thinking of a wild boar. You might add some wolf, too, I suggested, a hungry one, maybe with a disturbed mind. Pete nodded, and I watched his face slowly change, his features twisting into those of a crazed and vicious beast, with lots of snout. Suddenly, he opened his mouth, and out came a long, horrible, ear-splitting howl that made my blood run cold. He followed that up with a series of savage, snuffling snarls and low snorts. I was impressed. "What do you think?" he asked. He tried to look modest, but he didn't succeed. Pete knows he's good at animal imitations. In fact, everybody in our whole school knows he's good. Last year, Pete and I entered our school's annual radio drama contest, and when he read the play I'd written called Attack of the Killer Bees over the PA system, Pete really stole the show. The story was about an attack by giant killer bees on a jungle outpost, and Pete not only did your standard sound effects like creaking doors and whistling wind, but also the sound effects for both the heroine's pet gorilla Igor and the evil head bee Black Buzz. I'll never forget Pete's version of the final battle between Igor and Black Buzz. It was a masterpiece. 2 minutes of enraged snarls, howls, yips, grunts, and buzzes that kept the whole school on the edge of their seats. Just listening to him, I knew we'd win the contest, hands down. And we did. Pete's good all right, and now he had come through again. "Well," he repeated, "how was it?" "Let me put it this way," I told him with a grin. "It's definitely going to get their attention."